I boarded the train at 11:47 p.m., and by midnight I understood that something was wrong with the other passenger in my compartment. Not wrong in the way that people are sometimes wrong on overnight trains. Not drunk, not aggressive, not strange in any way I could name quickly. Wrong in a deeper sense. Wrong the way a reflection is wrong when it moves a half second after you do. I need to tell you about the train first, because the train itself was the first thing that should have stopped me. My name is Callum Reeves. I am 37 years old, a technical writer, which is to say a person whose entire professional existence consists of describing things clearly and precisely. I mention this because it matters. I am not a person given to suggestion or imagination or the misreading of ordinary situations. I am, by training and disposition, someone who looks at what is in front of him and describes it accurately. What I am about to describe was in front of me. I am describing it accurately. My grandmother had died, not unexpectedly. She was 91 and had been in steady decline for 2 years, but death, even when expected, arrives with an administrative force that is difficult to prepare for. The funeral was in a town 300 kilometers away. The last flight of the day had been canceled due to weather somewhere upstream in the routing. The morning train would arrive 2 hours after the service began. The night train, departing at midnight and arriving at a little after 6 in the morning, would get me there. So I booked it. I was standing in the airport with my rolling suitcase and my laptop bag, and the particular hollowed exhaustion of someone who has just been told that the thing they were counting on no longer exists. I booked the ticket on my phone. Standard overnight service. 1 sleeper compartment remaining. Upper or lower berth. I chose lower. I paid. I took a taxi to what the map on my phone described as the central station, and the taxi drove me to the wrong place. And the wrong place was where the train was waiting. The station was not the one I knew. I want to be precise about this because precision is what I have. The central station I had used on previous visits to this city was a modernized terminal. Digital departure boards, franchise coffee, bright lighting, the smell of fast food and floor polish. This was not that station. This was the old station, the one that had been decommissioned in the late 1990s when the new terminal was built 2 kilometers east. I had driven past it several times. It had been boarded, then fenced, then the subject of some heritage preservation argument, and the last time I had passed it there was netting on the facade and a council notice on the fence. Now the netting was gone. The lights were on inside. The main doors were open. The stone of the facade was darker than I remembered, not the dark of grime, but something deeper, as though the building had been absorbing the darkness of the street for a very long time. I stood on the pavement and looked at it. The taxi had already left. My phone had no signal, not reduced, not intermittent, but completely absent, a flat zero where the bars should be. The street around me was quiet and wet, and the few people visible were moving fast with their heads down, and I was cold, and my grandmother's funeral was in 6 hours. I went inside. The concourse was high-ceilinged and mostly empty. The light came from fixtures along the upper walls, not fluorescent, something warmer and more orange, the kind of light that throws shadows upward and makes familiar spaces look like their own older versions. The floor was original tiling, black and white, slightly uneven underfoot. The wooden benches that ran along the central space were the old kind, iron armrests dividing them into individual seats, each one slightly cupped from decades of use. A handful of people sat on them, not talking, not looking at phones, not doing any of the things that people in stations do while waiting. They were simply sitting, facing forward. At the far end of the concourse, behind a wooden counter with a brass grill, a man in a dark uniform looked up as I approached. He was somewhere between 50 and 70, with a face that was composed and gave nothing away. He looked at me as though he had been expecting me specifically. "Sleeper?" he said, before I could speak. "Yes," I said. "Compartment 7, berth 2. he said, and slid a ticket across the counter without looking down. The ticket was paper, heavy cardstock, slightly yellowed, printed in a typeface I didn't recognize. I looked at it. Compartment 7, Berth 2, Platform 4, Departure 015. I looked up. The departure board above the platforms, an actual mechanical board, tiles that flipped with that particular soft clacking sound, showed one departure. Platform 4, 015, my destination. I put the ticket in my jacket pocket and walked toward the platforms. The platform was cold and long and poorly lit, and the train was already there. Not a modern train, not even a recently maintained old train. This was actually old, dark green paint that had been applied many decades ago and repainted perhaps twice since, oxidizing now at the edges of the panels. Brass fittings around the windows turned green-brown with age. The windows were the old type, framed in wood, with a leather strap for opening from the top. The carriage numbers were painted on small enamel plates fixed beside each door, worn enough that some were difficult to read. I walked along the platform looking for carriage 7. The train was longer than I expected. There were no other visible passengers, no staff, no porters. The platform was mine alone. Steam rose from beneath the carriages in slow pale columns that bent and disappeared in the cold air. I found carriage 7. I climbed the metal steps, 3 of them, steep, with a handrail that was cold through my glove. The interior of the carriage was a narrow corridor with compartment doors on one side and a continuous window on the other, the window showing the dark platform and my own reflection back at me. Compartment 7 was the third from the end. I slid the door open. The compartment was small in the way that old sleeper compartments are small, not cramped exactly, but dimensioned for function rather than comfort. A fold-down berth on each side, currently both deployed as shelves of padded vinyl in a dark blue that had faded unevenly. A small table fixed below the window. Luggage racks above, made of polished metal that had lost most of its polish. The overhead light was a single bulb behind a frosted glass shade, warm and slightly yellow. The curtain over the window was dark blue cotton, slightly faded at the edges from years of sun. The whole space smelled of old upholstery, that particular combination of dust and fabric and the accumulated warmth of many previous occupants. And underneath it, something else. Something I noticed and could not place. Something faintly sweet, in a way that sweet things are not supposed to smell in an enclosed space. Not food, not perfume, something else. I noticed it and filed it and did not think about it further, which I would later consider a mistake. On the upper berth, lying with his back to me and his face turned toward the wall, was a man, a dark coat pulled to his shoulders. Completely still, I placed my suitcase on the luggage rack above the lower berth. I took off my jacket and put it with the bag. I sat down on the lower berth, which was harder than I expected and creaked once under my weight, and then was silent. I opened my laptop. I started a document. The train began to move. It moved without announcement, without whistle, without the sequence of jolts and adjustments and the gradual building of momentum that I associated with trains departing stations. It simply began to move. One moment stationary, the next in motion, as though the transition between the two states had been edited out. I looked up from my laptop. Outside the window, the platform was sliding past, and then it was gone, and then there was only darkness, the darkness of the city at night. Occasional lights, occasional shapes of buildings going past at a speed that felt slightly wrong. Not dramatically wrong, slightly. The way a clock runs slightly fast, not enough that you notice immediately, only enough that after a few hours you find yourself further along than you expected. I registered this and did not act on it, and went back to my document. I typed 2 sentences. I deleted them. I looked at the darkness outside. I looked at the man on the upper berth, who had not moved. I am a light sleeper in close quarters. I am accustomed to the rhythms of other people's sleep, the breathing, the small unconscious adjustments of position, the occasional sound. There were no rhythms. The man on the upper berth was as still as an object. Not the stillness of sleep. The stillness of something that was not doing what sleeping things do. I noted this. I told myself he was simply a very still sleeper. Some people are. I looked at my phone. No signal. No clock sync. I looked at my watch. 12:54 a.m. The landscape outside had changed in a way that I could not precisely account for. We were, or should have been, passing through the suburbs of a large city, which meant lights in buildings and the orange glow of street lamps reflecting off cloud cover. Instead, the darkness outside was denser than that, more consistent. Occasionally a light appeared, a single window, a lamp at the edge of what might be a road. But these lights were sparse and brief, and had the quality of lights seen from a great distance, which did not match the distance we should have been from populated areas. I looked at the window and tried to orient myself by what I could see and could not do it. The landscape was simply dark, in the specific way of countryside that has no nearby towns and has been this way for a very long time. I put my laptop away. There was no point pretending I was going to work. I sat with my back against the wall and my feet up, and I looked at the ceiling and I listened to the train. The sound of it was the sound of old rolling stock on old track. A particular combination of rhythms, the clatter of the bogies, the sway of the carriage, the occasional creak of the body against the frame. This at least was consistent with what I expected. Old trains sound like old trains. The sound was right even when other things were not. I found this mildly comforting. I held on to the sound and looked at the ceiling and did not look at the man on the upper berth. Around 2 in the morning, the man on the upper berth spoke. He did not move. He did not turn. He spoke toward the wall, in a voice that was quiet and level, and that carried clearly despite the noise of the train, the way some voices do in enclosed spaces, voices that are calibrated, whether consciously or not, to be heard precisely and no further. How long have you been on this train? I held very still for a moment. Then I said, since midnight. Roughly. A silence. The train moved. Then he said, which midnight? I did not answer immediately. I looked at the window, at the darkness sliding past and the occasional sparse light. And I thought about the question, and I did not have an answer that I was certain of. This one, I said eventually. Tonight. Another silence. Longer this time. Then, there are people on this train who don't know yet. I asked him what he meant by that. He did not answer. He said nothing else for a long time. I sat and listened to the train and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep. At some point between 2 and 3, I needed the bathroom, and I stood and opened the compartment door and stepped into the corridor. The corridor was lit by the same yellow-orange light as the compartment, a continuous run of it along the upper edge of the outer wall, and it was not empty. There were people in it. Not many. I counted 6 in the section of corridor I could see, standing or sitting on the fold-down seats that lined the window side of the carriage. They were not talking. They were not looking at phones or books or out the window. They were simply present in the corridor in the way that furniture is present in a room, occupying space, facing in no particular direction, doing nothing that required attention or intention. I recognized one of them. A woman in a dark coat who had been sitting on one of the wooden benches in the station concourse when I arrived. She was standing now, her back against the window, looking at the floor in front of her. I said, "Excuse me," as I passed. She did not respond. None of them responded. I reached the bathroom at the end of the carriage, small, functional, cold, with a mirror above the basin that I avoided looking at directly. When I came back out and walked back along the corridor, 2 of the figures had moved. Not moved away, simply shifted position. Different stances, different arrangement. As though while I was out of sight someone had rearranged them slightly and not quite finished. I went back to my compartment and closed the door and sat down on the lower berth and did not move for a long time. I looked at the window. In the glass, I could see the reflection of the compartment, the door behind me, the luggage rack, the upper berth. The man on the upper berth was reflected in the window, lying as he had been lying all night, dark coat to his shoulders. Except in the reflection, he was not facing the wall. In the reflection, he was facing me, eyes open. I turned around very quickly. He was facing the wall. I turned back to the window. The reflection showed him facing me. I looked away from the window and did not look at it again. My hands were flat on my thighs, and I concentrated on keeping them still. The train moved. The yellow light came under the door from the corridor. The man on the upper berth said nothing. "You should try to sleep," he said, still facing the wall, still not having moved in any way that I had witnessed directly. "You won't manage it," he said, "but you should try." I asked him why I wouldn't manage it. "Because you've started noticing," he said. "Once you start noticing, you can't stop. That's how it works on this train." I asked him what he meant by how it works. There was a long pause. The train rocked slightly on a section of uneven track, a sound and motion I recognized as real and physical and present, something to hold on to. Then he said, "The train runs between two places. It has always run between two places. Most passengers arrive at one of them." I asked what happened to the ones who didn't arrive. He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "They're in the corridor." And he said nothing else. And I sat with that in the small yellow-lit compartment while the train moved through the dark at slightly the wrong speed. I did not go into the corridor again. I sat with my back against the wall, positioned so I could see both the compartment door and the window without turning my head. And from this position, I could not see the window reflection. I watched the door. I watched the ceiling. At some point, I noticed that the man above me was casting a shadow on the ceiling, which was expected, but that the shadow was subtly wrong. Not dramatically, subtly. The shape of it did not quite correspond to the shape of someone lying on their side with their back to the room. It was too broad in certain places. It suggested a posture that did not match the posture I could verify by looking at the berth. And the shadow was oriented differently from what it should have been, given the position of the light. I looked at the shadow for a while. Then I looked at the berth. Then I looked at the shadow again. The shadow was facing me. I stopped looking at the ceiling. I looked at the door. I looked at the floor. I looked at my watch. 3:58 a.m. The train continued. The corridor light continued. Outside the window, the darkness continued. I breathed slowly and paid attention to everything and did not stop paying attention. At around 4:30, I am certain about this time, I looked at my watch repeatedly in those final hours. The man on the upper berth climbed down. I heard it before I saw it. The shift of weight, the creak of the berth frame, the measured placement of feet on the edge of the bed and then on the floor. He stood in the center of the small compartment and looked at me. I looked back at him. He was older than I had expected from the shape he made on the berth. Perhaps 70, perhaps somewhat older, with a face that I can describe now only in the vaguest terms. Composed, unremarkable, neither kind nor unkind. The kind of face that is difficult to hold in memory, as though it does not want to be retained. He was wearing a dark coat, well-made and old, and dark trousers, and he was carrying nothing. No bag, no ticket, nothing. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Your stop is next." I asked him how he knew. "Because you're still noticing," he said. "The ones who stop noticing don't get a next stop." He said it without emphasis, without urgency, as a statement of operational fact. He picked up nothing because he had nothing to pick up. He stepped to the door and slid it open and stepped into the corridor and slid it closed behind him. The corridor was silent. I sat for a moment, and then I stood and took my suitcase down from the rack and picked up my laptop bag and zipped my jacket and stood at the door with my hand on the handle. The train began to slow. Not gradually, not in the way trains slow as they approach stations, building deceleration across kilometers, announcing themselves. It slowed the same way it had been moving all night, at once, evenly, with the same quality of wrongness applied to a different direction. The lights outside the window changed, became more frequent, became the lights of infrastructure, lamps on posts, the edge of a platform appearing. The train stopped. I opened the door. The corridor was entirely empty. Every figure that had been standing against the wall, sitting on the fold-down seats, facing in no particular direction, gone. The carriage was silent in a way it had not been silent all night. I walked along it and down the 3 steps onto a platform and stood in the cold morning air. The platform was my destination city's old station. I recognized it even though I had not been inside it in perhaps 15 years, even though it had been officially closed for longer than that and was, as far as I knew, still the subject of ongoing preservation arguments. The roof was intact. The clock on the far wall was working. It showed 5:12 a.m. The sky beyond the roof, visible through the gaps where the glass panels had been replaced with boards, was the deep saturated blue that precedes dawn by about an hour. I stood on the platform with my suitcase beside me, and I turned and looked at the train. It was already moving. It had not waited, or rather it had waited precisely as long as it needed to, which was the duration of my descent from the steps, and no longer. It moved slowly, and then less slowly, and then the end of it passed the edge of my vision, and the platform was empty and quiet and cold. I stood and breathed and looked at the space where the train had been. Then I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the exit at the far end of the platform. The exit was unlocked. The street beyond it was ordinary, gray morning pavement, a parked car, the beginning of streetlights coming on in the pre-dawn. I found a taxi. I found the hotel I had booked. I slept for 2 hours. I went to my grandmother's funeral. I stood at the graveside in the November cold and thought about the corridor. The weeks since have been ordinary in most respects. I work. I sleep. I eat. I answer emails. The technical writing that constitutes my profession requires a precision that I find I am now applying to everything, to every surface, every reflection, every shadow. I take trains. I have taken 4 since that night. 3 were entirely normal, modern rolling stock, digital displays, coffee trolleys, other passengers who moved and breathed and looked at their phones. On the 4th, 2 weeks ago, an evening service of no particular significance, my phone lost signal for approximately 40 minutes somewhere in the middle of the journey. When the signal returned, I checked the time. 40 minutes had passed on my watch and 40 minutes had passed on the train's display. But the landscape outside the window was wrong for 40 minutes. We had covered too much ground. The countryside was too far along. I sat with my bag on my lap, and I paid attention to every detail, and I did not mention it to anyone, and the signal stayed, and the train arrived on time, and I got off at my stop and walked home. I still have the ticket from that night. Heavy card stock. The typeface I don't recognize. Compartment 7, berth 2. I keep it in my jacket pocket, the same pocket I put it in at the counter of the old station. I have not been able to bring myself to throw it away, and I have thought about why, and I believe it is this. Throwing it away would be a gesture of closure, and closure would mean accepting that the event is finished. I do not believe the event is finished. I believe the train is running tonight as it ran that night, on track that does not appear on any published network map, stopping at platforms and stations that have been officially closed for decades, picking up passengers who have booked ordinary tickets through ordinary channels and who have reasonable, practical reasons for needing to travel overnight. Most of them arrive at their destination. Most of them step off onto an ordinary platform in an ordinary morning and take a taxi and get on with what they had to do. The ones who don't, I think about them, standing in the yellow-lit corridor, facing in no particular direction, Not sleeping, not moving, not doing any of the things that people in transit do. Just present, just waiting. The man in the dark coat knew what they were waiting for and did not tell me, and I have decided that this was probably the correct decision on his part. I notice everything now, every shadow that does not quite match its object, every reflection that holds a beat too long, every fellow passenger who is too still for too long, every stop where the platform looks older than it should, where the clock is an analog face in a digital age, where the departure board uses tiles instead of screens. I am describing this accurately, as precisely as I know how to describe it, because precision is what I have. The train runs between two places. It has always run between two places. Most passengers arrive at one of them. I arrived. I paid attention, and I kept paying attention, and I arrived. I do not know if attention was the mechanism or merely what the man in the dark coat told me in the dark, and I do not know how to test the hypothesis, and I am not certain I want to. The ticket is in my pocket. The clock at the old station showed 5:12 a.m. Somewhere on a platform that does not exist on any current transport map, the departure board is flipping its tiles. One destination, always the same. The clock on the wall is moving, though not necessarily forward. And in compartment 7, on the upper berth, something is lying very still with its face turned toward the wall, waiting for the next passenger who books the last available ticket on the last available overnight service and needs to be somewhere by morning. Get there before midnight. Take the morning train. And if you find yourself standing on a platform you do not recognize, holding a ticket printed in a typeface you cannot identify, notice everything. Do not stop noticing. It is the only instruction I have, and I am passing it on in the hope that it is worth something. I arrived. I am still here. I am still noticing. I check the departure boards at every station I pass through now. Not because I expect to see something, because I expect that one day I will, and I want to be prepared when I do. The ticket is in my pocket. Compartment 7, berth 2. The old station is still standing. I drove past it last week. The lights were off. The doors were boarded. But the stone of the facade was darker than it should have been. Darker than weather and time alone could account for. I sat in the car and looked at it for a moment. Then I drove on. I am still noticing. That is all I know how to do. That, and pass on the one instruction that was given to me in the dark of a compartment on a train that should not have been running. Notice everything. Do not stop noticing. It may be the only thing that keeps you on the right side of the corridor. And if it is not, if attention is not the mechanism, if the man in the dark coat was simply a very old man who had his own way of describing something he did not fully understand either, then at least you will have seen everything clearly. At least you will have been paying attention when it mattered. That is not nothing. In my experience, it is almost everything. Still here.